This hour of programming is brought to you by Krista Knowles and Tom Fettig. You too can become a sustaining member of WOMR for as little as $13 a month. For more information, go to WOMR.org. Welcome to Healing Wisdom, a Thursday morning talk show featuring guests sharing their stories and knowledge. We discuss the healing aspects of the arts, metaphysics, social justice, and adventure through all types of terrain. So join me, Pandora Peoples, here on WOMR 92.1 FM in Provincetown and WFMR 91.3 FM in Orleans. We're streaming worldwide at WOMR.org. Today we welcome educator and historian Elaine Colley-Weintraub, author of Lighting the Trail, African American Heritage of Martha's Vineyard. Elaine created the Martha's Vineyard African American Heritage Trail, which now has 37 sites with an amazing group of people, and you are the founder. The tour incorporates history from slavery to the Underground Railroad, from abolition through the Civil Rights Movement and beyond. Welcome, Elaine. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
When you started off teaching school in Martha's Vineyard, what were the kids getting in terms of African American history?
They were getting any that I was aware of, and I was what I responded to that situation, that kids were not getting African American history, but I knew enough about cultural education to know that, particularly for the group of students I had, they needed to have African American history, and so did all other students. So it began as an idea. It grew and grew and grew.
And how did you begin adding new curriculum to your classes, and what was the response from the principal of the school and fellow teachers?
Well, I'll start with saying what the response was from students. They loved it because for the first time, history seemed real to them. I often start a class by saying, who likes history? And very few students raise their hand and say they like history because it's boring and they don't find themselves in it. I found that the students were just thrilled to go places that they knew. For example, I remember taking one class to the house where Dr. Martin Luther King stayed. And they'd heard about Dr. King every year. And they were just so thrilled. They were like, did he really sit here on this porch? And yes, he did. So that was amazing. So it was, the reaction from students was incredibly positive. From administration, not so much. It was tended to be ignored. Being ignored was one thing, but being actually hostile to it, which happened in 2017, that was a different thing. Fellow teachers, I think they were kind of indifferent to it. They knew that that was my thing and that was what I was doing. I didn't feel a great deal of hostility or it was more like, oh, well, that's what Elaine does. And I can't say that people had a burning desire to do it themselves, because they didn't. Painted that year, some painted 15 years before, were all painted out with white paint. So that was really an awful experience to walk in and see that. And you realize that so much of life is making realistic choices. When something like that happens, you realize that you can't do what you've been doing and you can't teach what you've been teaching. So it's time to move on.
How did your collaborations with community members begin? How did the Heritage Trail start to form after you decided to incorporate research and broaden the curriculum that you were teaching?
Well, it developed quite quickly, even though people say to me, oh, it's an overnight success, but it is 20 years, so I don't know how overnight it is. But it did develop quite quickly because I think what it brought was it responded to a felt need that people needed to the community had a need to know that. They found it interesting, they found it affirming, and so people did um, contact us with all kinds of information that they had. And of course, we went to our community and met people and talked with them about their family history and where we were going to put them, what was going to be on the plaque when we put it there. So it really was kind of, it did develop a life of its own. And I think that's because it was so authentic. It engaged the community, it involved the students. It became an authentic experience. So rather than people thinking, oh, well, what's this history about? We're actually excited about it. And they showed a great deal of sophisticated understanding, which, was kind of amazing. So I think as it developed, I would say it's collaboration within the community. It can never be people laying down the law about what's going to happen. This is what we're going to do. We're going to put this plaque on your house, and this is what it's going to say. It can never be that way. It has to be collaborative. It has to be interactive. It has to include everybody. And that was in the model that we pursued.
On the Cape and the islands, not much history of local slavery has been taught, and yet there is ample evidence for it. So I'd love for you to speak to the evidence for slavery on Martha's Vineyard that exists and where we can look for the stories of those who were enslaved.
Well, the evidence is quite strong that it existed. Of course, enslaved people don't leave a trail of information behind them, unlike free people who you can find evidence of their lives. So enslaved people tend to turn up in court documents or wills. And that was an area of research that I did an awful lot of reading, wills in the probate department in Edgartown. I think that the point of it was that, of course, enslavement existed here. Why wouldn't it? It existed all over America. Was the situation more complex here? Probably, because it was a small community, a maritime community. Nancy Michael, for example, was held, and the verdict given in the court case about her said that she was held and used as a slave, contrary to the laws of the Commonwealth. So that's pretty clear. But also, I think what we've realized with the work is that enslaved people weren't just enslaved victims, they were people. And enslaved here, yes, there was a racial hierarchy, all of that. But they were people, and they had a role to play. And that's been the fascinating part of the research that I've done. From Nancy, who was the wise woman who cursed the sailors, to Rebecca, the woman from Africa who inherited property for her lifetime, which was an anomaly of Massachusetts law. And recently, somebody sent me a document from Hartford, Connecticut, that talked about how somebody was trying to rescue an enslaved person. and they gave her to this, apparently, this woman who score and then said she would take her to Martha's Vineyard. She'd be all right there. So I think that thing, there was enslavement, yes, there were rescues, but not the sort of fashionable rescues that people talk about, like the big houses in Edgartown were all used to hide fugitives from enslavement. No, they weren't. Fugitives from enslavement were more than likely helped by Native Americans, which would make sense when you think Chappaquiddick Island. That would be a place, Aquina. So yes, it existed, but there's so much that we have to unravel. That abolitionists, for example, were not all white men. They were people from the Native community, from the African American community. So the situation and the story is complicated.
Frederick Douglass came over to speak as a freeman. Yeah. Gave a speech called Unity of Man to a packed meeting house at the Federated Church in Edgartown. And that was back in November of 1857. So the church is on the trail. Can you talk a little bit about the Underground Railroad? For example, you have a fugitive slave, Esther, escaped.
I found the story 15 years ago tucked in the corner of some place. And I thought, I have to come back to this old document. But Esther was found in 1700s when slavery was still legal in Massachusetts. And she had, as usual, it's very hard to find any definitive information. But she had escaped from a boat that had put in the harbor of Edgartown. She was supposed to be being transported back to North Carolina and to enslavement. The best information I managed to find was a deposition at the first mate on the boat that was holding her as a prisoner. And he claimed that they put a crowbar over her feet. They tied her hands behind her back. They placed her in the hold at the bottom of the ship. And when they woke up in the morning, she was gone. And that was their story, and they were sticking to it. Now, there's so many interpretations, maybe they did do all that, in which case they can't have been around because somebody did rescue her. She was gone. And they said she was gone and the longboat was gone with her. But, she didn't take a longboat and go off to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
That's not reasonable. I would imagine what she did was go to Chappaquiddick and hide out there. And so when we rescued her from obscurity and decided to put her on the trail, the National Network for Freedom, the federal government, we really liked the story, and they said, "Oh, we will have that." So that site is on the National Network for Freedom and has federal recognition, but it's incomplete in that we don't know. We don't know where she went. But we do know she didn't take a longboat from the boat and sail off to Canada. We do know that. And we do know that if she had no help, how is this going to work out for her? So my own theory is that she got to Chappaquiddick and she was assisted and rescued by the Native Americans there, and she probably stayed there. Whether she was other people, there's other theories, that maybe people broke into the boat and rescued her. Maybe. I somehow don't think so. I think maybe the slaveholders did not do all the things they said they did, the crowbar over her feet, the hands tied behind her back. Maybe they didn't do all that. And they weren't going to admit that because this was a legal deposition because she was worth money. And when it comes to money, people want to know what's happening. So did they not do all that and she escaped? I doubt that they necessarily helped her because it seems to me unlikely that they helped her. Because if you were a bounty hunter sailing enslaved people back to enslavement, would you be in the business of rescuing them? I don't think so. But these are all the questions that now John Saunders, he came also very early to the Vineyard. And according to his granddaughter, he was brought to the island by Captain T. Luce. Captain Luce would have been one of the founding English families here, who had covered him with corn, him and his wife Priscilla, covered them with corn and brought them to the island. You know, that's the thing too. If you're going to rescue somebody, you're breaking the law. So you're not going to run around telling everybody what you did and how you did it. So it is always piecing it together. The other story, of course, is in Aquina, the family of Randall Burton, who we know escaped to Canada. That we do know. His family say so, and Canadians published a book of stories from people who escaped. Randall Burton had run away from enslavement, and he said he'd resolved that he would rather die than go back again. And he was rescued by the Wampanoag tribe in Aquina, and they got him out and they got him to Canada. So the stories are really interesting, and they also prove that, yes, indeed, it was in the court case that was held about Rebecca. Evidence was presented that Rebecca had been enslaved, that she'd been whipped like a dog, that Nancy had been sold as a little girl. Those things were legal on legal record. So, yes, we know it was here.
You're listening to the Healing Wisdom Podcast, broadcast Thursdays on WOMR Outermost Radio. I'm Pandora Peoples, and my guest today is Elaine Weintraub, founder of the African Heritage Trail, author of Lighting the Trail, the African American Heritage of Martha's Vineyard. You can check out more of our podcasts on WOMR, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. Michael A. Martin, he was a black whaling captain. He was related to Nancy, right?
Nancy's grandson and Rebecca's great-grandson. He sort of managed to be quite successful as a captain.
Paul Cuffey. His first whaling voyage occurred in 1778, and author Skip Finley was saying that he estimates that of the crew members on these whaling ships, 30 to 40% of them were black or mulatto. Does that sort of ring true to you?
Yes, I think it could well be true, because you know, when I began this work and I was doing this work on William A. Mudson 20 years ago, I realized when I looked at the portraits of whalers, they were all white. But when I read the crew lists, and there were lots of crew lists, they weren't all white. So what you'd got was a bit like the murals. You got black people whited out in the pictures of the whaling trade. But in fact, you know, the Native Americans were the whalers who taught everybody else how to do it. And there were many of them, and there were many African Americans and Cape Verdeans.
And of these men, many were free.
Oh, yes, there would be. You know, you might be free, but when you sailed into another port in America, they put you in jail until the time for the boat to sail again.
Right after the Fugitive Slave Act became more and more dangerous as they were often captured. And then I think in some cases they were actually sold into slavery. So, yes, very, very dangerous.
Oh, I'm sure.
And also, just the interesting thing about whaling is because it was so arduous and took so long, and there was all kinds of things from pirates to illness, only 90% or so of people who went out on these trips went again for another round to do the whole thing all over again and continue in that profession. But one interesting thing is that Skip Finley says Black sailors were more likely to take another trip, especially during slavery, because it was a way to be free.
I was just going to say that, yeah, it's free, but not free, because the whaling trade was dirty, dangerous, and not a good deal. And it lasted 4 years. When you sailed out of Edgartown, you were going to come back in 4 years' time. That's quite a lot.
Your African American Heritage Trail covers artists, entertainers, business owners, and this includes, of course, the Villa Rose that you had mentioned, Joe Overton's mansion by the sea. You had mentioned that Martin Luther King Jr. stayed there. I think he wrote some of his speeches there. He definitely wrote correspondence there. So Joe Overton, for those who don't know, was a union organizer. Yeah. Can you talk about the history of the innkeepers, especially in Oak Bluffs, and how important that was?
Well, I think what we've discovered over the last few years is that many times when African Americans bought property on Martha's Vineyard, they bought it from Portuguese people. And the Portuguese people had come in the previous generation and probably had a similar experience. And there were property restrictions about where you could buy and where you couldn't buy. So that seems to have been really an influential relationship. We have several sites where the house was sold to African American people by Portuguese people. And so that's something that's been very interesting to look at. Partly they have probably a similar experience, so therefore more empathy. They're both in the areas like the Highlands, and for whatever reason, that's what happened.
It's a combination of redlining.
And there were many property deeds. You know, when it becomes illegal to discriminate, they don't change the deed. The deed stays the same because the deed is a copy of a sale and what that house is. And there were many that had this house is to be occupied by a member of the white race and the Christian religion, except in the capacity of servants. So there were many ways of making sure that things stayed the way they were.
Yeah, that is profoundly disturbing.
I know, but it's still there.
Can you talk a little bit about how this upper class came to be homeowners and all of these artists and business owners thriving and helping to foster and create a community for people to come and visit and vacation?
Yeah, I think people, the whole idea of you buy a house is always followed, in my experience as a researcher looking at these stories, always followed by what can we work at to make money while we're here to finance this? So there were a lot of landladies, as we call them, who rented out space in their houses. There was Shearer Cottage that began as a laundry, but then became an inn. There was Coleman's Corners, which was the brainchild of Luella Coleman, who worked every job she could find. Because I think it's important to remember there was no such thing of going to the bank and saying, hey, I'd like to invest in some property. Can I get a loan? No, you can't. And so Luella worked at every job she could find, bought the original house from a man called Manuel Silva and paid him $5 a month towards paying for that house. Eventually, she bought all the land down to the corner from him. So it worked out between them. But I think what's really important to stress is the hard work. Nothing for nothing. People working really hard, being landladies, running an inn, running a laundry, working at every job you can find to get enough money to buy a house. That's the story.
You say you're adding 2 new sites to the trail.
Mm-hmm. One is Taylor's Playfair, which was a boarding house run by the Taylor sisters and their mother. And it's featured actually in the Smithsonian African American Museum. Their brochure is on the museum's website. So our plaque actually has a picture of the brochure on it, which was quite an achievement to get it on there. And the other one is Ambler Wormley, who was the first African American to own businesses, who opened 2 gas stations and sold one to the Betancourt family in Oak Bluffs, who own it still. And they did a wonderful job of holding his story. So we're looking forward to dedicating that one. So those will be the 2 for this summer.
Wonderful. And folks can find your book on your site. Can you share that info?
Yes, it can go on our site, MV, African American Heritage Trail.org, and you can book a tour on there and you can buy the book.
Wonderful. So again, the book is Lighting the Trail, the African American Heritage of Martha's Vineyard. And of course, you're working on another book right now in the midst of research, and we look forward to talking about that when the time comes.
I am. I'm not sure when I'll get it finished, but that's the plan for a 4th edition of the book, because we keep developing more sites and doing more research, and therefore we need a bigger book.
Wonderful. Well, it's very cool to see right now. It's the 15-year anniversary and 3rd edition. It's wonderful that it just keeps growing. Thank you so much, Elaine, for doing the work that you do.
My pleasure. Truly, it is my pleasure.
This song is from chord player Saliu Suso.
African Renaissance, Africa Renaissance. Africa networking. Africa open business. Africa. This song is dedicated to African Renaissance.
You've been listening to Healing Wisdom at Outermost Radio. All of our shows are podcasts at WOMR.org. Also check out healingwisdomradioshow.com and contact me at pandora@WOMR.org.